Hi, everyone. I'm Belinda Payne, and thanks for joining me for our A Day at a Time podcast, where we talk about practical ways to empower you to thrive a day at a time. And we're going to take a conversational journey today where we shine the spotlight on exciting people like my special guest today. Her name is Carlette McTwire, and she's thriving at what she does by making the best use of her time a day at a time. So, hi, Carlette, and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here and share with you.
Wonderful. And I know that you've been on a journey. I've known Carlette for actually a number of years, even when she was in the womb, to be honest. But Carlette's been on a journey. She's been in the education system, I know, for well over 10 years. She began at the high school level. She was a
Mhm.
guidance counselor, a
Yeah.
teacher, an education program coordinator, an assistant director of school counseling, and even an adjunct professor of psychology. And she's moved on and she has actually founded her own business, CSM Counseling Solutions LLC. And wow, you're an entrepreneur,
Yeah.
you're a mental health professional, and an education consultant. So I'm really proud of Carlette personally, but even professionally. So that's why I wanted to bring her on to the podcast because I know that she has a special word to share with y'all
Mm,
about a particular subject that has really intrigued me.
sure.
So, what's I think most exciting to learn about Carlette before we kind of delve into her professional background is just want to ask you, Carlette, what makes you you? For an example, when you got on this journey in the first place, what is it that actually drew you or made your heart sensitive or compassionate about the journey that you're on? So, can you give us an idea? What is it that makes you you, and even the you that you're becoming?
Sure, sure. Look, it's actually funny that this journey is the complete opposite of where I ever thought I would
Mhm.
find myself. When I graduated high school, my high school mascot was a rebel. And I
Oh,
feel like
wow.
that describes me in a lot of ways, just having a
Uh-huh.
rebel heart, a rebel spirit. Because when I graduated from high school, I told myself audibly, I will never come back to this high school. And
Wow.
yet that was the high school that I went back to
Uh-huh.
begin my teaching career. And when it came time for me to transition into the work that I do now, being a counselor and now a therapist, I told myself, this is not the kind of work that I
Right.
want to do. This is not life giving for me. And yet,
Uh-huh.
it is the very place that I find myself. I find so much, life in it. I don't take it for granted, though, that I have had experience in the public sector, private sector. So I've worked for Fortune 15 companies as well as healthcare. And so
Okay.
I use all of those things to help guide and
Mhm.
inform the work that I do now, not just professionally, but in the ways that I interact with human beings, meeting people
Mhm.
on the street.
Mhm.
I think we all want to have a sense that we are seen, we're heard. Our
Yes.
experience matters to each other, and so to be able to provide that space, whether
Mhm.
I'm in a grocery store
Yeah.
and someone just tells me, you
Mhm.
have one of those faces that looks like you want to listen. I'm like, yeah, I do. And, I'm happy to, be a safe space for them to share their experience. Or, sometimes I could be at the doctor's office getting
Yeah.
blood work done and I'm tell
Here
me
you
more about
are.
that because
Right.
yeah, they just feel comfortable doing it. And so I count it a blessing that it's not just my professional work, but it's really become purpose work for me, which shows just how much that God can use you in a myriad of spaces, and sometimes in places that you don't even imagine.
So as y'all are listening, you can kind of figure this out, that she's smart, she's articulate, she's kind, inside and out. She's a beautiful person, inside and out. And Carlette, I know that you have a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the field of mental health or mental health professionalism.
Mhm.
And one particular area that I think was most intrigued about, I heard you speak about this and I read something that you had written and you spoke about a particular area that honestly I had never heard of before, and that was called compassion fatigue. And so, as you're speaking about maybe even just being in the doctor's office and you're there for one reason, but here you are ministering to the doctor
Right.
because you recognize probably some of these characteristics or traits in people in the store, in your gas, just doing common things every day. So I want to just kind of dab right in there, really, and just get us started on this thing about compassion fatigue. And can you help us to understand how did you land on the doorstep of compassion fatigue?
Sure. So it was actually born out of my own experience.
Hmm.
I've told this story before. It was right before Hurricane Harvey,
Okay.
and the hurricane was coming, but I had no awareness of this hurricane, materializing in the Gulf. And I
Hmm.
get back to my desk, and I find out that school is going to be closed. We all get to
Hmm.
go home, and I'm
Right.
thinking like, okay, great, we need a break. And it dawned on me at that point, I had not been to the grocery store. We done
Yep.
absolutely no prep work
And we know
for,
how that goes, right?
yeah, no prep work whatsoever. And the reason for that is that I had been so consumed in the business of helping others that I had been sacrificing important aspects of my life.
Hmm.
And, while other people, you could see a panic look, pensive looks on their faces, wondering what was going to happen with this storm, I was
Right.
the only one smiling. And it wasn't that I wasn't, full of compassion for those who were about to experience maybe something they hadn't before. A
Mhm.
hurricane, even for those of us who are native to this
Mhm.
area, is
Mhm.
can be a very scary thing. And in
Right.
fact, I had family members who had suffered, tragically
Mhm.
as a result of Hurricane Katrina. So the compassion and the empathy was not the issue. It was just that I had become fatigued
Right.
from being compassionate. And when you think about what is compassion fatigue, I really want to start with the definition of self-care. So self-care says that, we can
Mhm.
be helpful to others without sacrificing the important aspects of our life. And so compassion fatigue by its very nature is the opposite, where we are working to continue to be helpful to each other,
Mhm.
helpful in our professional work, but
Mhm.
it's coming at the expense of aspects of our life that also need attention. And so we find ourselves giving from an empty well. And there used to be a time where compassion fatigue was
Mhm.
relegated to certain professions. So EMS workers, firefighters, police
Mhm.
officers,
Mhm.
medical staff. But I think, the pandemic era has shown us that compassion fatigue really expands much broader than that.
So
Those
let
who
me get you to pause there for just
Okay.
a second because you are really like right in the middle of where I was going with this. So I'm glad that these are some of the aspects that you're
Mhm.
bringing out. And one of the things that I wasn't sure that you would even share, and that was the personal side of it. And thank you for doing that because I wasn't sure if we could just get you to share because that always helps us to understand, even as a professional, that we all suffer. I don't know if that's a good term to say, or we have
Mhm.
symptoms, or we come have seasons in our lives or periods where we are actually having and experiencing compassion fatigue, and we may not even realize that we're in that. So you did something that I really wanted you to do, which was define it.
Mm.
And then you brought in the self-care aspect of it because that's been a big thing over the last few years about self-care and the fact that, whether they're a professional, and I'm gonna bring something in about that professionalism that I want to see if you can speak to too.
Sure.
And so as you're talking about that and you dissected that for us, then I wanted to see if we can if you can do something for me before we move on too far, and that is tell me how do you recognize compassion fatigue from burnout? Because a lot of people think, that was my era, that's all we knew, you just
Yeah.
burn out. But
Yeah.
but now, I've looked at that and I've done some reading. What is the difference between compassion fatigue and burnout?
Sure. So compassion fatigue, stress,
Mhm.
and burnout, and even emotional overwhelm are
Yeah.
sometimes terms that get lumped in together. They can be used
Right.
anonymously.
Mhm.
But I read an article that I think really accurately parses out the difference between the two. So, stress is related to things associated with our physical body. And yes,
Understood.
those can be brought on by environmental, factors that we're
Of
dealing with.
course.
Burnout has to do with the actual like work of being a professional.
Okay.
Compassion fatigue has to deal with relationship.
Okay. Good.
And by that, that's why I was, saying earlier, I don't think that compassion fatigue is just relegated to certain professions
Right.
because, like I said, with the pandemic, it showed us I can really, really care about the work of being a caregiver
Mhm.
for my ailing loved one.
Mhm.
And yet the compassion part of me says like I don't have anything else to give.
That's
And
right.
so that impacts the relationship. And I think the
Okay.
reason why these things can be synonymous is because we do form
We do.
relationships in our working
That's
environments.
right.
But the burnout has more to do with the actual work you are performing. And then compassion fatigue can become another component of that because it is the relationships that
Okay.
are impacted sometimes as a result of the work that's being performed.
Okay, now you said something, and I had this thought in my mind too, because we are not ignorant of what we've all gone through. We've gone through a pandemic,
Yeah.
and it has been very trying and stressful on everyone. I don't care who it is. And when I thought about that and I look back, I said over the past, 3, 4 years, we know that a lot has transpired and it's transformed our lives in a significant way. No one's been left out. Even newborn babies have emerged, from their mother's womb in a different way. The dad couldn't be in the room. So the mom is there and they had expectations, along the lines or along the journey of carrying the baby. Dad's going to be in the room or grandma, whoever it is. We're just used to that. And then we get to that point, and here it is, the baby's emerging into the world with a different picture from all the other babies that have been experiencing this for many, many years. And even had a grandson that was born in 2019 in November. And I remember us wearing a mask. First, we couldn't go and see him for a long time. We waited. We wanted to protect him and his parents, and as well as ourselves. We were senior people, but when we did, we wore a mask around him. So for quite some time, on these infrequent visits, I should say, he couldn't see our full faces. And so the
Mm.
other thing was he couldn't see us talk. He didn't see our mouths move. And so one of the things I began to think about was, he doesn't really know us. Like, my kids got to know my parents, or you and your grandparents, or whatever. And so I began to think, they're used to watching a mouth move and talk and formulating that so they can talk. And then you see this much of a person's face, so they don't really see us. And I thought about all of those things, and I thought, you know what? This change impacted everyone. So it kind of bothered us as the new grandparents. Of course, it didn't bother him. He didn't know, but it still made us feel like, this is how children develop speech patterns. They see a mouth moving, and then they begin to what? Understand that that means someone's saying something. They begin to formulate words and thoughts in their head. So even with that, this change that happened, and then speaking of relationship, all of this kind of came into being, or it impacted us in such a way that we began to wonder about, the tryingness, the stress of it. The parents, the new parents, they didn't get to take the kid to the places they normally do for a year. This kid was in the house. So, when you think about things like that as you're talking about it, and I want to tie that part of the compassion fatigue, and then the other piece was, yes, there are professionals who are going to work. Like you said, we used to think that maybe that was people who were in the healthcare industry and things like that. But the other piece is that those people who are, I would put them in the category of a skilled health professional, because they've got a senior mom at home, or they
Yes.
have a child that they're taking care of 24/7. And so they likely, and I'm not trying to say that this happens, it's more of a question. Do they also suffer from compassion fatigue? As a professional, have you all learned or begun to see that there are more people, lay people, who are actually suffering from compassion fatigue because of the relationship, and they don't get to clock out.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
doing it 24/7.
You said it exactly, and I think one of the important pieces for me is to elevate the fact that you can be challenged with compassion fatigue,
Hmm.
and the work that you're doing as a helper is not paid work.
Okay.
So that includes caring for,
Yep.
an ailing relative.
That's right.
During the pandemic, many of us were used to
Hmm.
having the assistance of the school system
Hmm.
regarding feeding our children, educating our children, and then
Yeah.
suddenly all of your children
That
were
take
in the home with you. And you were becoming,
right.
not just their parent, you were their teacher, the
Uh-huh.
principal, if you needed to be, you were
Hmm.
all these things. And again, it wasn't that you don't care about
Hmm.
your children, but you
Hmm.
realize I'm now sacrificing important aspects of my life to be able to be a helper. And that is where we can become susceptible to compassion fatigue. The example that you gave about your grandson
Hmm.
being born and how the conditions in the hospital were much different, right? So
Yeah.
what that means is while a nurse or, someone who is a part of the delivery process had the ability to rely on the
Hmm.
father,
Hmm.
grandparents,
Hmm.
other loved ones to help usher in this baby into the
Yes.
world.
Yeah.
That particular caregiver had to be all of those things,
That's right.
holding the hand and
Yeah.
coaching, and then also still doing their jobs. And then you
Yes.
think about the number of times they did that during the day. And if
Yes.
they were not refilling their own wells, well, again, I can't stress this enough, sacrificing the important aspects of ourselves to try to continue to be a helper. And
Somebody.
so when you use that definition,
Mhm.
lots of us can fall into that category, which I think is appropriate. I
Mhm.
have so many clients who will come to me and describe their experience.
Nice.
And when I tell them there's a word for it, you can just see such a sense of relief
Yeah.
on their
I bet.
face
I
to know
bet.
I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
Someone has studied this. This is in a
Hmm.
textbook.
Hmm.
Just to have that experience, have a name, and that's important.
It is, and I'm glad you said that because again, when I first started out, when I heard you give this, I won't call it a documentary, but when I heard you teach this before, and when you said it, and I was like, wow, there's a name. It's called compassion fatigue, and I'm like, I don't know who came up with it, but it's real, and it's not something that's isolated or relegated to certain people. So one of the things I looked some information up, just kind of wanted to make sure I even had a better idea or scope of what it is. And so, talk about for us, does compassion fatigue happen suddenly or does it develop over the course of time? What do experts say about that?
Sure. So compassion fatigue, just like burnout
Mhm.
and stress, the forms of stress that are harmful to
Mhm.
us, they're not something that we just wake up and suddenly feel it. It's slow and gradual. There's, I always think about death by a thousand cuts, and
Wow.
how, if someone is to make little tiny marks on your body, those
Hmm.
tiny marks are not going to cause you to bleed out and, have reason to
Yeah.
go to a hospital. But over time,
Yeah.
a thousand of them will
I can
have the
imagine.
same
That is
impact as,
good.
an
Yeah.
immediate blow. And
Yeah.
so compassion fatigue can be that same way where,
Okay.
we convince ourselves that we can still keep going,
Mhm.
or that we can, rely on 50% of the amount of sleep that we're used to, not eating as healthfully as
Mhm.
we should or could. And over time, we then begin to see, like, I don't feel the same about this experience that I do. Sometimes also, compassion fatigue comes upon us when we have had a consistent lack of training in what we are being asked to do, and feeling like we don't have the ability to reach out for help. So initially, we
Mhm.
want to be the superheroes
Yeah.
in our
Right.
story and feel like, you know what, it's okay. I don't have all the skills for this. I can do this. But over time, that
Mhm.
can also make us susceptible to compassion fatigue because we want to do well. We're just not being given the things that we need to do that. And so, again, we start sacrificing important aspects of our lives to try to compensate for sometimes even a lack of
Mhm.
training.
So pause right there because it never occurred to me. And if there are listeners that are listening about this, because they may have, put this in a category, well, I'm not a caregiver, so I'm not going to have compassion fatigue. But you just brought in the aspect of a corporate environment. So when you said, that we take on a job or we're given an assignment and we don't have a skill to do that. So I know you've explained it, but can you elaborate that more on just maybe a practical way that people can understand how that could happen to them and what might they begin to recognize that it is triggering compassion fatigue?
Sure, sure. I think it's noticed quite a bit in leadership roles,
Okay.
where maybe we have been, taking those natural steps
Mm-hmm.
to become a leader in our organization.
Mm-hmm.
And leadership, it sounds great. The money's probably great, but we may not have necessarily been equipped with all of the skills that are necessary, not just for doing the job, but leading people well, because that
Okay.
in and of itself is something that requires
Mm-hmm.
training, time, mentorship, experience. And so, you're offered this opportunity, and it's like, yes, I feel like I can do this role, and
Mm-hmm.
people are people. I understand people. We get into it. But, over time, when we start to realize the different aspects of that leadership role pull at, places of our lives professionally,
Mm-hmm.
places of our lives personally, and we don't have the skills to meet the demands of whatever that, leadership role is requiring, well, what begins to happen? Our relationship component can start to be sacrificed, right?
And
So
that
maybe in time,
relationship, like at home or family reunions or
relationship at
friends,
home
where it
and
bleeds over
relationship,
into that.
correct, yes, relationships at home, in
Okay.
addition to the relationships of those who really in theory could be helpful to you with the
Mm-hmm.
things that you are lacking,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of skill and ability. So, we find ourselves turning inward, becoming resentful. Maybe we're coming home tired because we're spending exorbitant amount of time trying to catch up so that no one
Mm-hmm.
perceives us as being behind the eight ball, as it were. And again, we can even start developing symptoms of, the common cold or the flu. There
Mm-hmm.
was a article that I read about one particular person wishing, now listen to this,
Mm-hmm.
wishing to have a broken arm.
Wow.
And
Just
you think to
because of
yourself,
the pressure at work, give them an
yes,
excuse not to
who
have
would
to be there or
ever,
do the work, right?
yeah, who would ever wish for a broken limb? But if we're getting to that point that we start to,
Mhm.
envision ourselves with illnesses
Or
and things that
injuries.
we're
Yeah,
at the point of compassion fatigue. But we
oh,
don't wake up, in the morning thinking, I would
right,
like to have a broken arm today so that I can get a day off from work.
right. Wow, that is something. So when you're saying that, it ties right into the thought that I was thinking about. If studies show that compassion fatigue impacts us physically, emotionally, psychologically, all three. And from what you're saying, it is all three. They
Yeah,
all combine. We're a whole person. So that's we can't separate what's going on in our mind because it impacts our body. And then
right.
eventually it impacts our health and our well-being. So do you find in the studies from your colleagues or things that y'all write and that you read, is it more gender specific? Do we find that there are more males versus female or a certain age group that y'all are beginning to see that this is a
Mhm.
trend with?
So, in the studies that I have been privy to, there's
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of information about whether or not the phenomenon of compassion fatigue is gender specific. But here's what I will say: just like anxiety, depression,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the other, mental health challenges that we are faced with, they present very differently
I see.
in a male versus female. And a female has the ability to sometimes be more vocal about the experience. So they're
Okay.
talking, and then I'm able to say, okay, here's what you're experiencing. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, with my male clients, their narrative is
Okay.
different, and so you really have to be attuned to what they are saying to be able to, pinpoint the experience. But there's nothing to say that
Mm-hmm.
a woman experiences this more than a man. And I would also say this too regarding the age group, because we know that there are unfortunately children, teenagers who have to assume caregiver roles for their parents.
Right.
And
That's
so it's
right.
not, that they aren't being susceptible to compassion fatigue as well. It's just we don't conceptualize their experience in this way,
Or we
which
think
is why,
children are either like maybe not supposed to
right,
talk
right.
back or don't do this, and then we think they're being rude, but maybe it's because they're just compassionately fatigued.
Correct, correct. Having to take care of siblings. Sometimes,
Uh-huh.
there is a parent who is not,
Mhm.
fully able bodied, and,
Mhm.
they help with the not just the regular chores around the house, but helping to, make sure that their parents have the things that they need. And they come to school and you have no idea that that
Right.
experience is taking place. But, again, I think this is why it's so important to have these conversations
Hmm.
about what it means to be fatigued, regarding compassion, because I do think that it can, span,
Hmm.
age range and gender as well.
I'll get you to pause for a quick second because this wasn't even a thought, but I love the fact that we're talking and we're almost done. But you said something, and I think it's important so that listeners, parents who do have young children or parents, so many grandparents and aunts and uncles now are raising younger children. They were done with their kids, but things have happened and somehow they had to take in a young person. So, like you said, when that child comes to school and they're falling asleep, at their desk, maybe it's because, that parent or that person that they're caregiving for, they have to get up in the middle of the night and give them meds or give them water or all types of things. And
Right.
so, when you just said that, it never occurred to me even that there are young people, maybe in elementary school and middle school, who are dealing with compassion fatigue, and it's something that has been put on their plate. It's not necessarily always that they're up playing video games at night or they're doing something wrong. And so it's a good thing. Maybe I don't know if y'all are already doing this, going into the young school systems, in the elementary and middle school age,
Mhm.
and even high school, talking with counselors so that maybe they can begin to recognize this in young people.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to
Okay.
point out too that it's not just, the physical aspects that, a teenager or a young child
Hmm.
might display, but the fact that maybe they can't show a certain level of empathy
Hmm.
towards classmates or even you as their teacher,
Wow.
assistant principal, because the amount of empathy that they were able to muster up for that day, the amount of compassion that they had already been
Tapped
exhausted
out.
before
Wow.
they were on the school bus.
Wow. That is
And so
awesome.
to you, they seem
Mhm.
irritable and combative and not wanting to participate in the classroom experience, when they're fatigued.
They have maxed out with their emotional
Yeah.
ability to express
Hmm.
compassion.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, just kind of wrapping it up, I wanted to just kind of say something, even with me personally, because when we read all these articles about exercise, diet, food intake, different things that trigger us, lack of sleep, like you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, not exercising or resting, or, simply just not even knowing when to take a break. And when I looked at my life as we prepared even for the podcast, and I thought, I'm sure that I have suffered from compassion
Mhm.
fatigue. And I looked at things and I thought, well, Belinda, what are some maybe personal symptoms that I have had? And they're not documented medical things, but I look back and I thought, what about when I'm gulping my food down and I'm not chewing and I'm standing up eating all the time and I'm not even in a hurry? I'm like, Belinda, why are you standing up eating
Mhm.
at the counter
Mhm.
in your own house when you could sit down? Or, even as I've been doing the podcast now, I've had to learn how to take a breath, Carlette. I've
Yes.
had to learn how to breathe. Stop talking so fast, Belinda. Why are you talking so fast? You're totally out of breath. Things like that. And then when I would say my prayers at night, my shoulders were up. I'm kneeling at
Mhm.
my bed, and I realized I'm like, Belinda, why it's time to rest, and your shoulders are tense.
Yeah.
And so I learned that all these for me were signs of stress. And so when you
Yes.
spoke of that earlier, one of the things I'm learning is that it had built up over time. And so I needed to recognize within my body and with my own persona what are signs and signals that I'm stressed and how can I make changes. So I started doing some things. I started doing just breathing exercises, even when I'm sitting here working, to stop, take 30 seconds, Belinda, and do the deep breathing. I put the little app on my phone and all that kind of stuff. Put the Calm app on it. Other things, even if you don't want to buy an app, breathing exercise. Then I would lay on the floor, just put my hands down to the side, look up or close my eyes or whatever I needed to do and teach myself how to calmly relax. Put your
Yeah.
palms down, Belinda. Make sure your fists aren't clenched, Belinda. Different things that you don't even realize when you go to bed. You're holding your fists and you're laying in the bed. It's like, oh. release your hands, relax for a few minutes, and all things like that. So I'm being honest as you're sharing this stuff with me that I want people to understand that we all are stressed, but it's important that each one of us recognize some of those signals in our own bodies that
Yeah,
is leading or may put us on that road that we don't want to be on with compassion fatigue.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's so true. So what you are describing is completing the stress response cycle.
Okay.
And the stress response cycle has, generally four components where we're at rest. Then there's an activating event. And then we
Mm-hmm.
need to figure out how to mobilize to address whatever that situation is.
Uh-huh.
But oftentimes we miss the last part, which is having a moment of restoration. And
Okay.
that's a moment to come back to self. We jump back into the next activating event. And if we're doing that
Over
constantly,
and
we're
over.
not giving our body what it
Okay.
needs. We're not giving our minds what it needs
Mm-hmm.
to restore so that we are fully prepared to address, whatever the next situation is. And, I want those who listen to the podcast to recognize that it can be the very serious things all the way to the mundane. So you
Mm-hmm.
finish cleaning the house and then you jump right into, okay, now I need to go to the grocery store. Then
Right.
you jump right into, now I need to run these. When it's like, well, you could clean
Right.
the house and then take a break.
Right.
You have a moment of restoration. And
Right.
then you can address the grocery shopping. And after
Right.
that, take a break to have a moment of restoration. And, in addition to that, the part of the restoring
Mm-hmm.
process is giving our stories a place to live outside of us, because that's also a big component of compassion fatigue. When we are eyewitnesses to the suffering of others, as because we're trying to help, right? We're trying to address, a need that someone has, but it can live in our mind a lot longer than that event is taking place. And so that might look like journaling, prayer, being
Mm-hmm.
able to record thoughts that you have, on whatever smart device, so that you
Yeah.
give it a place to live
Amen.
outside of you.
I
And
love
you don't
that.
have to experience a constant heaviness that's associated, with the work of being a helper.
I really love that, that it needs some place to live so that it's not living inside of you all the time. Like, and I do journal and this phone, man, probably use it to take notes more than anything, even more than talking, but we do need to take that out of our brain and deposit someplace so it has some place to live. I was looking at another speaker, whatever, and she sells these things called phone beds. And so one
Mm,
of the things that she talked about, I think it was Ariana Huffington, or it might have been someone else, but anyway, it's literally like a little bed. It has a little sheet. It's about this big, just enough for a little cell phone. And it was like, put your phone to bed at night. It needs someplace to live outside of your nightstand or outside of your hand or outside of laying next to you while you're in the bed, because we are so, like you said, we go from one thing to the next and we're just stimulating our brains and our minds, and it doesn't get to take a break. So I'm glad that you said that we need to take some of these things outside of our body, put it somewhere else to live, and then come back to it, even just with daily chores, because that was
yes.
kind of where I wanted to close us out. That what are some things that you would recommend that people can even do in the comfort of their own home? They don't always, may not have the money, may not have the means to go out always and necessarily get the professional help, but what are some little things that they can just begin to do for themselves in their own home as a stress relief mechanism in their daily activities? And you kind of said it, and that's learning to stop, sit down. You don't have to back and then do the dishes, then do the wash, and then, run out of the house. But what other things might a person be able to do so that they can hopefully ward off that road of compassion fatigue?
Yeah, yeah. But so something that gets a look from me,
Hmm.
towards me, I should say, when I tell people this is, look, understanding that no is a complete sentence.
Hmm.
And I like my mom in her very kind way, when she feels
Hmm.
like no might be, too harsh for someone. It's
Right.
not at this time.
Ah,
Um,
like
and
that.
I've read a book. It's called Essentialism. It was given to me some years ago. And
Uh-huh.
the premise of the book is that we say no to the wrong things in our lives so that we have room for the appropriate yes.
I love that. And the book
Um,
is Essentialism?
Essentialism. Hmm.
Okay, okay.
Another thing that I would recommend to listeners is to pay attention to your body's cues. But the
Hmm.
way you do that is by slowing down, right? Our body sends us signals all day long about the things that it needs. And, I've explained to clients before, you will either give your body what it needs or your body will take
It,
what it needs. And so, which do you prefer? And so, listen to your
yeah.
body's cues so that you can freely give it what it needs to keep functioning and being the best, for you,
Hmm.
rather than your body taking what it needs and maybe
Okay.
taking you to a hospital or, some other place
Right.
that you don't want to be as a result of just continuing to, engage in very stressful
Mm.
situations. And then, finally, what I will also say from a spiritual perspective is to
Mhm.
remember to pour so that you can be refilled. And I think God is so amazing in the way that He will refill us
Mhm.
as we are pouring into the people and the purpose that He's assigned.
I
And
love
so
that.
when we start to
Mhm.
experience symptoms of compassion fatigue,
Mhm.
that's a time that we may need to ask Him, God, am I pouring into the things that you have
Right.
assigned to me right
That's
now?
right.
Am I pouring into the people you've assigned? Because I might be doing a lot of
That's right.
pouring, but
That's right.
that's not where you're
Strong.
intending for me, yeah, to be.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm, arriving at this place of feeling fatigued with my compassion, because maybe you've assigned to me these two people and
And I
I'm trying to fulfill the needs of 200, but you haven't asked that of me at this moment in my life.
all right. And of course, we like quick remedies or quick fixes, and you've just addressed that, and that's discovering and recognizing and accepting where you are at that time and what level you should be at, and not trying to pursue something that's outside of that purpose, that given purpose at that time. Whether you're a spiritual person or not, we all have a purpose, and we need to recognize what season we're in for that purpose. And then if we're not, like your mom saying, we can say no, not at this time. It doesn't mean that it's off the table, that we'll never be able to do it, but we can politely tell people, no, not at this time. No, I'm not ready. Let me get back with you. I'm going to need a few months or anything like that. So if you had the whole world's attention, Carlette, uh, and on this podcast for about 2 or 3 minutes or whatever, what would be your final thought that you want to leave our listeners with, that they can take with them and they can apply your thought to their life a day at a time, that's going to help them to thrive and to recognize how they can thrive even if they are experiencing compassion fatigue? Is there an end? Are they going to recover? Are they going to get back to normal?
Yeah, yeah. I think a message that I carry in my heart all the time and try to share with as many people as I can is grace applied.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is applying grace to ourselves for our own situation. So if we have arrived at a state of compassion fatigue, be
Mhm.
gracious to yourself, be kind to yourself. This is not where you intended to be. You didn't wake up saying, you know what, I'm going to work myself in terms of being a helper to no end and then
Uh-huh.
arrive at having an empty well. And so
Mhm.
be gracious and kind to yourself. And then also allow people to offer and extend grace to you,
Mhm.
because sometimes we can find ourselves in situations of compassion fatigue because
Mhm.
we've said, oh no, I got it, I don't need any help, I can do it, I'll be
Of
fine.
course.
And the truth is we all, we need the assistance of
Right.
others. And sometimes explain to my clients that we are relational beings.
Mhm.
We serve a relational God. He made us for
That's
relationship.
right.
And
That's right.
so one of the best ways for us to
Mhm.
ward off
Mhm.
compassion fatigue is to remember the value of connection, the value of relationship, that
Mhm.
even in our helping work, we're not meant to be helpers alone. We are meant to shoulder the experience of being, caregivers for one another. Even in my
Yeah.
private practice, I still have to partner with the psychiatrist. I
Mhm.
partner with your primary care
Mhm.
physician. I may partner with the school counselor because it takes all of us to
Yeah.
be able to, support one person's,
To make us a whole
health and
person.
well-being. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the audience or for Carlette, I just really honestly want to say that this has been a very intriguing and inspirational, inspiring conversational journey with you today. I've learned so much.
Yes.
that I will apply to my life. And I hope that the listeners will apply to keep these golden nuggets, in my pocket every day to help me remain balanced, because it's easy to get off track. Like you're saying, we don't just, it doesn't happen overnight. It's kind of accumulating over time. And if we're not careful, it'll catch up with us. Then it'll sabotage everything we're doing. And, it'll take over the cockpit of our lives. And then we'll be trying to figure out, well, how do I get restoration? And so you've explained all of that about the empty well, about the pouring, about setting things aside, compartmentalizing things so that they don't just, take over our lives. Because compassion fatigue, y'all, it is a real thing. But I'm thankful to Carlette for sharing with us today and helping us to realize that there are real solutions as well for compassion fatigue, and it will help us. Experts, professionals like Carlette are here to help you, to help me to recover from compassion fatigue. So I want to thank you, Carlette, and your colleagues and the industry that you're in, that y'all are letting us know this is out there, and we know mental health is real,
Yes.
but a lot of people are afraid of it, afraid of the term. But when we make them into small chunks, maybe that will help people to be able
Yeah.
to make it a more palatable, so that we can say, you know what, I can identify with that. So, any parting words, and then we'll just kind of close out. But thank you.
Sure. No, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here.
Mhm.
Every time I have an opportunity to put a face to what mental health looks like in terms of like who your provider may
Right.
be, what they sound like, knowing
Hmm.
that they're a human being just like you, I think it goes a long way to reduce the stigma that is associated with accessing mental health care. And I hope that experiences like this, people wonder, well, what does it feel like to be counseled? I'm like, well, listen to this podcast and just got counseled a little bit. So I hope that this, goes a long way to help people in their journey of being courageous to reach out for help when they need it. So thank you for this
I,
platform.
I love it. Hallelujah. So we're going to have Carlette back, in the future, because I know she has a lot to share. Y'all may have questions. So if people want to reach out, Carlette, or get information, do you want to share that, or tell people how they can even find compassion fatigue therapists in the industry?
Sure. So first, to connect with me, the best place to start is with my website. So you can visit csmcounseling.com.
Mhm.
There you can find lots of information about me, things that I've posted. I also have a podcast. It's called the Seen, Heard, Whole podcast. We're in our third season. We're actually about to launch the third season. And that gives you also an opportunity to connect with the experience of what it may feel like to receive wisdom, guidance, insight from a counselor's perspective. And,
Right.
I believe in sharing part of my experience there. So you get to learn a little bit about me
Mhm.
through there. I'm also very active on Instagram. Sometimes I post videos, just things to help you along your journey
Mhm.
on LinkedIn as well. Regarding the question with a compassion fatigue professional. So there are professionals who are certified in compassion fatigue. It's not its own separate modality. So if you are looking, for someone who is
Mhm.
well versed in that, you'll also be looking for someone who has knowledge and insight expertise regarding anxiety,
Okay.
cognitive behavioral therapy, because a lot of the things we do to address compassion fatigue may be born out of anxiety symptoms, sometimes trauma as well, because trauma can be associated with compassion fatigue. So those are the things that you may be able to Google and look for more readily to
Mhm.
find someone who has
Mhm.
experience with this particular area of work.
Perfect. Excellent. And thank you.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
y'all, audience, don't forget what I always like to tell y'all. Don't forget that time is a teacher and everyone is a student for life. And I'll see you on your journey next week, this time, as we continue learning how to thrive a day at a time. Hope y'all have a wonderful week. God bless y'all. Thank you, Carlette. We'll talk soon.
Awesome.
All right.